The unease surrounding Kammy Haddock did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself in any obvious way that others could immediately question. Instead, it settled gradually into the quiet corners of daily life, embedding itself within pauses, glances, and unfinished conversations, until the absence of truth became more noticeable than any lie he might have spoken aloud. From the outside, Kammy continued to move through the village with the same familiar rhythm that people had come to expect, maintaining the image of someone carefree and unbothered by the weight of ordinary struggles. However, beneath that surface, the consistency of his behavior began to fracture in subtle ways, and those fractures, though small, were impossible to fully conceal #L from someone who paid close attention. That someone, inevitably, was Belle Dingle. Belle's concern did not come from a single moment of doubt, but from a gradual accumulation of inconsistencies that began to reshape her perception of the man she thought she understood. She noticed how conversations that once flowed easily now seemed to stall whenever they approached anything personal, and how Kammy's answers, though technically reassuring, often lacked the depth that would have made them convincing. There was a growing sense that parts of his life existed just beyond her reach, deliberately kept out of view, and while she tried to respect that boundary, the silence surrounding those missing pieces began to weigh on her more heavily with #ch passing day. At the same time, Kammy was navigating a reality that had become increasingly difficult to sustain, one built not on intention, but on necessity. The barn, hidden away from #E center of village life, had become the place where his carefully maintained facade no longer mattered, and where the truth of his situation revealed itself in its most unfiltered form. The conditions were harsh and unrelenting, offering little comfort beyond the basic shelter it provided, yet it remained the only space where he did not have to pretend. In that isolation, his daily routine reduced itself to the simplest acts of survival, each one reinforcing the distance between the life he had lost and the one he was now forced to endure. His financial situation had deteriorated gradually, beginning with manageable setbacks that he believed he could overcome, but escalating into a series of consequences that spiraled beyond his control. Missed payments turned into mounting debts, and the pressure of those obligations eventually forced him into a position here maintaining his home was no longer possible. Despite the severity of his circumstances, Kammy chose not to share any of this with Belle, not because he doubted her willingness to support him, but because the act of admitting his failure felt more unbearable than the situation itself. His silence, therefore, was not simply an attempt to deceive, but a defense mechanism rooted in pride and fear. Meanwhile, Belle's internal conflict intensified as her concern evolved into suspicion, not driven by mistrust, but by the growing realization that something fundamental was being withheld from her. She found herself replaying their interactions in her mind, searching for clarity in moments that now felt incomplete, as though she had been given only fragments of a larger truth. One particular moment highlighted the extent of her distress, when she found herself holding Kammy's phone, confronted with the possibility of crossing a line she had never previously considered. The hesitation she experienced in that moment reflected not only her respect for his privacy, but also her discomfort with the version of herself that was beginning to create. Although she ultimately chose not to act on that impulse, the mere fact that she had considered it revealed how deeply her uncertainty had taken root. When she later admitted this to Kammy, her vulnerability was genuine, shaped by guilt as much as concern, and she hoped that his response would restore the trust that had begun to erode. Kammy's reassurance, while calm and carefully delivered, failed to resolve the underlying issue, because it addressed only the surface of her concerns without confronting the truth beneath them. His words suggested honesty, yet the absence of substance within them created a contradiction that Belle could not ignore, even if she struggled to articulate it. As this tension developed within their relationship, a separate chain of events began to unfold elsewhere in the village, one that would soon intersect with Kammy'S hidden reality in a way he could not anticipate. The ongoing investigation into the fires had already created an atmosphere of suspicion, with residents increasingly alert to anything that appeared out of place. For Robert Sugden, this situation represented not just a mystery to be solved, but a problem that demanded immediate and decisive action. His approach to uncovering the truth was direct and often confrontational, driven by a determination that left little room for uncertainty or hesitation. Initially, his suspicions were directed elsewhere, briefly focusing on Mackenzie Boyd before shifting again when evidence failed to support that assumption. However, the nature of suspicion is inherently unstable, and #D once it begins to move, it rarely disappears without finding a new target. That shift occurred when a report came in regarding suspicious activity in one of the fields, a development that immediately captured Robert's attention and prompted swift action. Accompanied by Aaron Dingle, he responded without delay, both men driven by the urgency of preventing further damage and identifying whoever was responsible. What they encountered upon arrival was a scene that appeared to confirm their worst expectations, presenting an image so clear that it seemed to eliminate the need for further investigation. Kammy stood there holding a petrol can and a lighter, the implications of that combination impossible to ignore given the circumstances surrounding the fires. From their perspective, the conclusion was immediate and unavoidable, shaped by the visual evidence before them rather than any deeper understanding of Kammy'S situation. The accusation followed naturally, delivered with the confidence of individuals who believed they had finally uncovered the truth they had been searching for. Kammy'S attempt to respond was hindered by the very nature of what he was trying to explain, as the context necessary to justify his actions required revealing the same truth he had been determined to keep hidden. Without that context, his denial lacked the credibility needed to counter the evidence against him, leaving his words ineffective against the assumptions already forming around him. The situation escalated rapidly, fueled by rising tension and the emotional intensity of the confrontation, with Robert's frustration pushing the interaction toward conflict while Aaron attempted to prevent it from spiraling completely out of control. Despite this intervention, the dynamic had already shifted, and Kammy could sense that he was no longer being seen as an individual, but as a suspect defined by circumstance. Faced with the imposed liability of resolving the situation through explanation alone, and unwilling to expose the full truth of his circumstances, Kammy made a decision that would ultimately deepen the consequences he was trying to avoid. Instead of continuing to argue against an accusation he could not disprove, he chose to remove himself from the situation entirely. His departure was not calculated, but instinctive, driven by the immediate need to escape a confrontation that had become overwhelming. However, that decision carried its own implications, reinforcing the perception of guilt in the eyes of those he left behind and ensuring that suspicion would only intensify in his absence. Shortly afterward, the impact of that moment began to extend beyond the initial #L confrontation, as Aaron Dingle took it upon himself to inform Belle of what had occurred. This decision introduced a new dimension to the situation, bringing Kammy'S carefully maintained secrecy into direct conflict with the relationship he had been trying to protect. With that, the fragile balance he had constructed between truth and concealment began to color #PSE, as the consequences of his silence converged in a way that made it increasingly difficult to separate his intentions from the assumptions now being made about him. The consequences of that single moment in the field did not unfold all at once, but rather spread outward with a slow and deliberate intensity, touching each person connected to Kammy in ways that would prove increasingly difficult to undo. What had initially appeared to be a misunderstanding quickly began to solidify into something far more damaging, as perception overtook truth and assumption filled the gaps left behind by silence. For Belle #Engel, The shift was immediate yet deeply disorienting, because the version of Kammy she had been trying to understand was suddenly replaced by a version she did not recognize at all. When Aaron Dingle approached her with what he and Robert Sugden had witnessed, the information did not simply add to her existing doubts, but rather redefined them entirely. The image described to her was too specific, too tangible to dismiss as coincidence, and as she listened, she found herself reconstructing the moment in her mind with increasing clarity. Kammy standing in the field, holding objects that directly connected him to the fires, created a narrative that aligned too easily with the unison she had already been feeling, and that alignment made it harder to defend him than she wanted to admit. Despite this, her instinct was not to condemn him immediately, but to search for an explanation that could reconcile what she had heard with what she believed about him. That instinct, however, was complicated by the fact that Kammy himself had already established a pattern of withholding information, and the absence of transparency now worked against him in a way that neither of them could control. At the same time, Kammy had retreated further into isolation, both physically and emotionally, as the weight of the situation began to press down on him from all sides. The barn, which had #NCE served as a temporary solution to a practical PR problem, now took on a different significance, becoming a space defined not only by necessity, but by avoidance. Within that confined environment, the reality of his circumstances became impossible to ignore, and the decision to remain silent about them began to feel less like a choice, or like a trap of his own making. Each passing moment reinforced the distance between himself and the people who might have helped him, and that distance grew heavier with the knowledge that it was, in many ways, self-imposed. Meanwhile, Vinnie Dingle became the only person with access to the truth Kammy had been hiding, a position that placed him in an increasingly difficult situation as events continued to escalate. When Kammy finally chose to confide in him, the admission did not come easily, but rather emerged from a point of exhaustion where maintaining the facade was no longer sustainable. The details of his confession revealed the full extent of his desperation, outlining a progression of financial decline that had culminated in a decision he himself seemed to recognize as both reckless and inevitable. Losing his flat had not been a single catastrophic event, but the result of accumulating pressures that had gradually eroded his stability until there was nothing left to hold on to. Within that context, his plan to set fire to his own car was not framed as an act of malice, but as a misguided attempt to create a solution where none existed. The logic behind it was flawed, yet understandable in its desperation, reflecting a mindset driven by immediate survival rather than long-term consequence. Vinnie's response was shaped by both concern and frustration, as he struggled to reconcile the friend he knew with the choices that Efriend had made. While he could understand the circumstances that led Kammy to that point, he also recognized the severity of the situation, particularly in light of the ongoing investigation into the fires. This understanding placed him in a position where remaining silent felt increasingly irresponsible, yet breaking Kammy's confidence risked causing further damage to an already fragile situation. As a result, Vinnie found himself attempting to navigate a middle ground, encouraging Kammy to tell the truth himself, while also trying to mitigate the immediate fallout. Back in the village, Belle's emotional state continued to deteriorate, as the gap between what she knew and what she did not know became more pronounced. The information she had received from Aaron had not provided clarity, but rather intensified her need for it, and that need drove her to seek out ANSWS directly. Her decision to turn to Vinnie was not accidental, but based on an instinct that he might hold a piece of the puzzle she was missing. When she found him already with Kammy, the convergence of those separate #E threads created a moment charged with expectation, as though the truth had finally reached a point where it could no longer remain hidden. However, what followed did not resolve the tension, but instead deepened it in a way that neither Belle nor Kammy had anticipated. Despite having already revealed everything to Vinnie, Kammy found himself unable to repeat that honesty in front of Belle, constrained by the same pride and fear that had kept him silent from the beginning. Hashtagging. The contrast between what he had admitted privately and what he refused to acknowledge publicly created a dissonance that was immediately apparent, particularly to Belle, who had arrived expecting clarity, and instead encountered further evasion. In that moment, his silent key carried more weight than any accusation could have, because it confirmed the possibility that the worst assumptions might be true. Vinny's attempts to intervene, to suggest that there was more to the situation than it appeared, were undermined by Kammy's continued refusal to speak, leaving Belle with no tangible reason to reconsider her conclusions. Without access to the truth, she was forced to rely on the evidence available to her, and that evidence pointed in a direction she could no longer ignore. The emotional impact of that realization manifested not as anger, but as a profound sense of disappointment, rooted in the belief that the person she had trusted had chosen not to trust her in return. That imbalance, more than any specific #IC action, became the defining factor in her response, shaping the #decision that followed. When Belle ended the relationship, her choice was not impulsive, but the result of a process that had been unfolding for some time, gradually eroding the foundation on which their connection had been built. The repetition of that ending, occurring for a second time, reinforced the finality of her decision, suggesting that the underlying issues between them had never truly been resolved. Kammy's reaction to this outcome was marked by a continuation of the same silence that had contributed to it, as he remained unable to articulate the truth even in the face of losing the relationship he had been trying to protect. His refusal to speak was not an indication of indifference, but rather a reflection of the internal conflict that had defined his actions from the beginning. In choosing silence once again, he effectively allowed the narrative surrounding him to solidify without challenge, accepting the consequences of that narrative rather than #inting the vulnerability required to change it. This acceptance, however, did not bring resolution, but instead set the stage for further escalation. As the situation progressed, external forces began to move in ways that would remove Kammy's ability to control the outcome entirely. The investigation into the fires continued to develop, with authorities gathering information and narrowing their focus based on the evidence available. The events that had already taken place, combined with Kammy's actions and subsequent behavior, created a framework that positioned him as a central figure within that investigation, regardless of the full truth behind his intentions. This framework, once established, proved difficult to dismantle, particularly in the absence of contradictory information. Looking ahead, the prospect of Kammy's arrest introduced a new phase in the unfolding situation, defined not by personal choice, but by institutional intervention. This shift carried the potential to force the truth into the open, not through voluntary confession, but through necessity. At the same time, indications from those involved in portraying the storyline suggested that the current developments represented only the beginning of a much larger progression. The layers of Kammy's character, hinted at but not yet fully revealed, pointed toward further revelations that would complicate the narrative even further. His outward demeanor, characterized by confidence and deflection, had already begun to give way to a more vulnerable reality, and that transformation was expected to continue as the pressures surrounding him intensified. The removal of that protective facade would not only expose his circumstances, but also challenge the perceptions others had formed about him. In this way, the story extended beyond the immediate conflict #T, evolving into an exploration of how hidden struggles, when left unaddressed, see and reshape relationships and identities in ways that are both unexpected and reversible. The aftermath of the breakup between Kammy Haddock and Belle Dingle did not erupt into chaos immediately, but instead settled into a heavy stillness that carried far more weight than any argument could have. It was the kind of #silence that lingered long after words had failed, embedding itself into the spaces where connection once existed and leaving behind something fractured and unresolved. For Belle, the decision to walk away had not brought relief in the way she might have expected, but rather a deep and persistent ache that followed her through every moment afterward. Ending the relationship had been an act of self-preservation, yet it did not erase the emotional investment she had placed in it, nor did it silence the questions that continued to echo in her mind. She found herself caught between two conflicting instincts, on urging her to trust what she had seen and been told, and the other clinging to the belief that there had to be more to the story than what Kammy had allowed her to understand. That internal conflict manifested in subtle ways, shaping her interactions with others and leaving her increasingly withdrawn as she attempted to process what had happened. At the same time, Kammy's situation had reached a point where avoidance was no longer sustainable, even if he continued to rely on it as his primary response. The loss of Belle marked not just the end of a relationship, but the collapse of the one connection that had the potential to anchor him amidst the instability he was experiencing. Yet even in that moment of loss, he remained unable to act in a way that might have altered the outcome, as the same barriers that had prevented him from telling the truth earlier continued to hold him in place. His silence, once a form of protection, now functioned as a constraint, limiting his ability to repair the damage that had already been done. Meanwhile, 6NNY Dingle found himself increasingly burdened by the knowledge he carried, as the gap between what he knew and what others believed grew wider with each passing day. His loyalty to Kammy conflicted with his awareness of the consequences that loyalty might bring, particularly as the situation began to attract greater attention within the village. Vinny's attempts to encourage honesty had been met with resistance, and while he could understand the reasons behind that resistance, he also recognized that the longer the truth remained hidden, the more damaging its eventual revelation would become. This awareness created a sense of urgency that contrasted sharply with Kammy's continued reluctance to confront reality. Elsewhere, the investigation into the fires continued to advance, driven by individuals who were no longer willing to accept uncertainty as an answer. Robert Sugden remained particularly focused #D on uncovering the truth, his determination fueled not only by #E need for justice, but also by a growing frustration with the lack of clear answers. From his perspective, the encounter in the field had provided a level of clarity #T had been missing up until that point, and while he was aware that appearances will sometimes be misleading, the combination of evidence and behavior he had observed made it difficult to consider alternative explanations. Aaron Dingle, though slightly more cautious in his approach, could not entirely dismiss the conclusions that Robert had drawn, especially given Kammy's decision to flee the scene rather than remain and defend himself. That choice, regardless of its underlying motivation, had reinforced the #perception of guilt in a way that was difficult to counter. As a result, the narrative surrounding Kammy began to solidify within the community, shaped less by confirmed facts and more by the accumulation of circumstantial evidence and unanswered questions. In a village where information traveled quickly and speculation filled the gaps left by uncertainty, this narrative gained traction with alarming speed. For Belle, hearing these perspectives echoed by others only deepened the emotional impact of her decision, as it created the impression that her doubts had been justified, even if that validation brought her no comfort. The possibility that she had misjudged Kammy still lingered, but it became increasingly overshadowed by the consistency of what she was hearing. At the same time, Kammy remained physically close to the village yet emotional #lie and socially distant, existing on the periphery of a community that had already begun to redefine him based on incomplete information. The barn, once merely a place of necessity, now took on an almost symbolic significance, representing both his isolation and the hidden reality he continued to protect. Within that isolation, the weight of his choices became more pronounced, as he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions without the distraction of external interaction. The plan he had formed in desperation, to set fire to his own car as a means of financial escape, now appeared increasingly reckless in hindsight, particularly given how closely it aligned with the crimes being investigated. This realization did not immediately lead to a change in behavior, but it did begin to shift his internal perspective, introducing a growing awareness that higher situation could no longer be contained through silence alone. The possibility of external intervention, once distant, now felt inevitable, and that inevitability carried with it a sense of impending loss of control. Meanwhile, the emotional distance between Kammy and Belle continued to widen, even in the absence of direct interaction, as both struggled with the unresolved nature of their final exchange. For Belle, the lack of closure made it difficult to fully move on, as unanswered questions often hold more power than definitive #illusions. Her attempts to find stability led her back toward familiar sources of support, including Vinny, whose own position in the situation remained complicated by his knowledge of the truth. In their conversations, he attempted to introduce nuance without betraying Kammy's confidence, suggesting that the situation might not be as straightforward as it appeared. However, without concrete information to support those suggestions, his words carried limited weight, and Belle found herself unable to reconcile them with the evidence she had been presented. The result was a continued state of uncertainty, where doubt persisted, but lacked the foundation needed to challenge her any #tile decision. As all of this was unfolding, the broader implications of the investigation began to take shape, with authorities moving closer to formal action based on the information available to them. Kammy's presence at the scene, combined with his subsequent behavior, positioned him as a central figure in their inquiries, regardless of the full context of his actions. The prospect of arrest, once a distant possibility, now emerged as an imminent reality, introducing a level of urgency that could no longer be ignored. This shift represented a transition from personal conflict to institutional consequence, where individual choices would be evaluated within a legal framework rather than a relational one. For Kammy, this development marked a critical turning point, as it threatened to expose the truth he had been trying to conceal under circumstances that would strip him of the ability to control how that truth was revealed. The difference between voluntary honesty and forced disclosure became increasingly significant, highlighting the cost of delaying a decision that now seemed unavoidable. At the same time, the evolving nature of the situation suggested that the current understanding of events was incomplete, with indications that further revelations would complicate the narrative rather than resolve it. The hints provided about Kammy's deeper character and hidden struggles pointed toward a storyline that extended beyond the immediate conflict, promising additional layers had yet to be uncovered. The sense of escalation created an atmosphere where resolution felt distant, replaced instead by the expectation of further complications that would challenge both the characters involved and the perceptions that had already been formed about them. The moment the situation crossed from suspicion into formal intervention did not arrive with dramatic warning, but rather with a quiet inevitability that had been building beneath every prior event. For Kammy, the transition from being questioned within the village to being pursued by authorities marked a shift that fundamentally altered the nature of everything he was facing. By the time the police became directly involved, the narrative surrounding him had already taken shape in a way that left little room for reinterpretation. The combination of circumstantial evidence, witness accounts, and his own behavior had created a framework that placed him at the center of the investigation, and once that framework was established, it began to operate independently of the truth he had yet to reveal. The arrest #elf was not chaotic, but it carried a weight that was far more unsettling because of its controlled precision. There was no need for raised voices or visible force, as the authority behind the action was enough to communicate its seriousness. For those who witnessed it, the #E of Kammy being taken into custody served as a confirmation of suspicions that had already begun to solidify. Within that moment, Kammy's internal conflict reached a critical point, as the consequences he had been trying to avoid finally manifested in a way that could no longer be ignored. The silence he had relied on as a means of protection now worked against him entirely, stripping him of the opportunity to shape the narrative before it was defined by others. Meanwhile, Belle Dingle experienced the news of his arrest with a mixture of emotional responses that were difficult to separate from one another. On one level, the development appeared read to validate the decision she had made to distance herself, reinforcing the belief that her concerns had not been misplaced. However, that validation did not translate into satisfaction or relief, because it was accompanied by a deeper sense of loss and unresolved doubt. The finality implied by Kammy's arrest made it more difficult to hold on to the possibility that there might have been an explanation she had not been given, yet that possibility did not disappear entirely. Instead, it lingered in the background of her thoughts, creating a subtle tension between acceptance and uncertainty that shaped her response to everything that followed. She found herself revisiting their last interaction, not in search of regret, but in an attempt to understand whether there had been something she had failed to see. At the same time, Vinnie Dingle was confronted with the consequences of remaining in a position of partial silence, as the progression of events forced him to reconsider the balance he had been trying to maintain. The knowledge he held now carried a different kind of weight, one that extended beyond personal loyalty and into the realm of accountability. Watching Kammy being taken away made it increasingly difficult for him to justify withholding information, particularly when that information had the potential to alter how the situation was being understood. Yet even in that moment, the complexity of the situation prevented any immediate resolution, as the decision to speak out carried its own risks and implications. Elsewhere, Robert Sugden maintained his conviction that the arrest represented a step toward resolving the uncertainty surrounding the fires, interpreting the development as evidence that the investigation was moving in the right direction. From his perspective, the alignment between what he had witnessed and the authorities' actions reinforced the belief that his instincts had been correct. Aaron Dingle, while less absolute in his conclusions, found it increasingly difficult to argue against the direction events were taking, particularly given the lack of contradictory evidence. The absence of an alternative explanation allowed the existing narrative to dominate, even as small doubts persisted beneath the surface. As this dynamic continued to unfold, Kammy's experience shifted from one defined by external perception to one shaped by internal realization, as the environment he now found himself in forced a different kind of reflection. Removed from the immediate pressures of maintaining appearances, he was confronted with the cumulative effect of the decisions he had made, each one contributing to the situation he was now facing. Within that context, the distinction between intention and consequence became increasingly significant, highlighting the gap between what he had meant to do and what others believed he had done. His plan, conceived in desperation, had been limited in scope and directed toward a specific outcome, yet its overlap with the broader events in the village had transformed it into something far more serious. This realization did not immediately provide a solution, but it did begin to alter his perspective on the situation, introducing the possibility that continuing to remain silent might no longer serve any purpose. The factors that had initially motivated his silence, pride, fear, and the desire to maintain control, now appeared less relevant in the face of consequences that extended beyond his ability to manage them. Meanwhile, Belle's interactions with others in the village reflected the broader shift in perception that had taken place, as Kammy's arrest influenced not only how he was viewed, but also how those connected to him were positioned within the social dynamic. Conversations that once revolved around uncertainty now carried an implicit assumption of guilt, and that assumption shaped the way people approached the situation. For Belle, navigating these interactions required a careful balance between acknowledging what had happened and maintaining her own emotional boundaries, as she attempted to process the situation without becoming fully defined by it. Her responses remained measured, avoiding definitive statements, while also resisting the urge to defend a version of Kammy she could no longer fully understand. At the same time, Vinny's role became increasingly pivotal, as he represented the only direct link between the known narrative and the hidden truth that had yet to be revealed. His internal conflict intensified as the situation progressed, driven by the recognition that the longer he remained silent, the more difficult it would become to correct the narrative if and when he chose to do so. This tension positioned him as a potential catalyst for change, though whether that change would come through voluntary action or external pressure remained uncertain. The complexity of his decision was compounded by the emotional implications it carried, as any action he took would inevitably affect multiple people in different ways. As the investigation continued, the possibility of uncovering additional information introduced a new layer of uncertainty into the situation, suggesting that the current understanding might not represent the full picture. This potential for further development aligned with broader indications that Kammy's storyline was still unfolding, with additional twists expected to emerge. #E's hints pointed toward a deeper exploration of his character, one that would move beyond the immediate circumstances and examine the underlying factors that had shaped his decisions. The gradual removal of the persona he had presented to others suggested that what remained would be more complex and less easily defined, challenging the assumptions that had been formed about him. In this way, the arrest did not serve as a conclusion, but rather as a transition point within a larger narrative, one that continued to evolve as new information and perspectives came into play. The story, far from reaching resolution, was entering a phase here the boundaries between truth and perception would be tested more directly, with consequences that had yet to fully reveal themselves. The progression of events following Kammy's arrest did not bring clarity in the way many had expected, but instead deepened the complexity of the situation, revealing how fragile the line between truth and perception had become. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward case continued to unravel in subtle ways, exposing gaps that could not be fully explained by the narrative that had taken hold within the village. Within custody, Kammy was no longer able to rely on avoidance as a strategy, as the structured nature of the investigation forced him into a position where responses were no longer optional. The environment itself removed the distractions he had previously used to delay confronting reality, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his decisions and the growing awareness that silence had reached its limit. The questions posed to him were direct, focused on establishing a clear connecting on between his actions and the fires that had caused such disruption. Each answer he gave carried weight, not only because of its content, but because of the context in which it was delivered, with every hesitation and omission contributing to the overall interpretation of his guilt or innocence. At this stage, the distinction between what he had intended to do and what he was being accused of doing became increasingly difficult to communicate, as the overlap between those two realities created a narrative that was inherently confusing. His admission regarding the plan to destroy his own car introduced a partial truth that, while honest, risked reinforcing the broader assumption on that he was capable of more serious actions. This created a paradox in which telling the truth did not necessarily work in his favor, because the truth itself aligned too closely with the accusations being made against him. As a result, Kammy found himself navigating a situation where transparency did not guarantee understanding, and where every attempt to explain only seemed to complicate the narrative further. Meanwhile, outside of custody, the impact of his arrest continued to resonate throughout the village, shaping not only how he was perceived, but also how others interacted with one another in response to the unfolding situation. Conversations that once centered on speculation began to shift #OAD interpretation, as individuals attempted to make sense of what his arrest meant in practical terms. For Belle Dingle, the development marked a turning point in her emotional journey, as it forced her to confront the reality of a situation she had only partially understood before. The physical absence of Kammy, combined with the formal nature of his detention, created a sense of distance that made it easier to accept the version of events she had been given, even if that acceptance remained incomplete. However, the process of acceptance did not eliminate the underlying questions that had been present from the beginning, and those questions continued to influence her thoughts in subtle ways. She found herself reflecting not only on the recent events, but also on the entirety of their relationship, reconsidering moments that now appeared differently in light of what had happened. This reflection did not lead to immediate conclusions, but rather reinforced the idea that her understanding of Kammy had always been partial, shaped by what he chose to reveal rather than the full scope of who he was. That realization introduced a sense of ambiguity that prevented her from fully committing to a single interpretation of his actions. At the same time, Vinnie Dingle reached a point where maintaining silence became increasingly untenable, as the consequences of withholding the truth extended beyond personal loyalty, and began to affect the broader situation. His awareness of Kammy's actual intentions, combined with the escalation of events, created a pressure that could no longer be easily managed. The decision he faced was no longer simply about protecting a friend, but about determining whether that protection was contributing to a misunderstanding that could have far-reaching consequences. This shift in perspective altered the nature of his internal conflict, transforming it from a personal dilemma into a moral one. Elsewhere, Robert Sugden and Aaron Dingle continued to process the developments in their own ways, each interpreting the situation through the lens of their previous experiences and instincts. Robert's confidence in his initial #SMENT remained largely intact, supported by the progression of events that seemed to validate his suspicions. Aaron, however, maintained a more measured stance, recognizing that while the evidence pointed in a particular direction, there were still elements of the situation that did not fully #IGN. This awareness prevented him from reaching a definitive conclusion, even as he acknowledged the difficulty of arguing against the prevailing narrative. As all of this was unfolding, external commentary from those connected to the production of the storyline introduced an additional layer of anticipation, suggesting that the current events represented only a fraction of what was yet to come. The indication that further twists were planned implied that the existing narrative would continue to evolve, potentially challenging the assumptions that had already been established. This expectation aligned with the gradual unveiling of Kammy's character, as the layers of his personality and circumstances continued to emerge in a way that complicated #Ather than clarified his role within the situation. The initial perception of him as a straightforward suspect gave way to a more nuanced understanding, one that acknowledged both his flaws and the pressures that had shaped his decisions. In this context, the storyline began to shift from a focus on isolated actions to a broader examination of how individual struggles can intersect with larger events in unexpected ways. Kammy's personal crisis, rooted in financial hardship and emotional isolation, had inadvertently positioned him within a much larger narrative involving crime, suspicion, and community tension. The convergence of these elements highlighted the unpredictable nature of consequence, where actions taken in one context can have unintended implications in another. This interconnectedness reinforced the idea the situation could not be fully understood through a single perspective, but required a more comprehensive view that considered both intention and outcome. Looking forward, the trajectory of the story suggested that resolution would not come through a single revelation, but through a series of developments that would gradually reshape the narrative. The possibility of further disclosures, whether through Kammy, Vinnie, or external investigation, introduced a sense hashtag of ongoing uncertain hashtag why that kept the situation open-ended. For Belle, this uncertainty represented both a challenge and an opportunity, as it allowed for the possibility that her understanding of events might change, even if she was not yet ready to act on that possibility. For Kammy, it represented the final stage of a process that had begun long before his arrest, one that would ultimately require him to confront not only the external consequences of his actions, but also the internal factors that had led him there. In the broader context of the village, the situation served as a reminder of how quickly perception can solidify into belief, and how difficult it can be to reverse that process once it has taken hold. The interplay between secrecy, assumption, and revelation created a dynamic that extended beyond the individuals directly involved, influencing the collective understanding of events in WIs that would continue to evolve. As the storyline moved forward, it became clear that the current developments were not an endpoint, but part of a larger progression T-Hat would continue to unfold, bringing with it new information, new conflicts, and new perspectives that would further challenge everything that had been assumed as #OFA.